Okay, we are going to make a small coil vessel, something that is utilitarian, is functional, and this is just going to be a warm-up vessel. It's one of your three warm-up techniques that you're going to learn. So we learned pinch pot. Now we're going to do coil, and then we're also going to do a slab. Functional object. And so what I would do is on this just, something small, like a small cup. Doesn't have to be big. This is just to get you a little bit more experience and with using coils and rolling coils and that type of thing. So what you're going to do is you're going to start with some sort of base. It doesn't have to be round. But I just rolled this out a little while ago, and it's about, I don't know, about a 1/4 inch thick, a little bit more than a 1/4 inch, and that's going to form the base, and we're going to put coils on that. So, but the first thing we need to do is to take our wedged piece of clay. So I wedged this a little while ago, and what I'm going to do now is just roll some coils. So I'm going to take out a piece of clay like that. I'm going to start by just rolling it in my hands to kind of like, get it started. I try to get it at least, fairly round. Kind of, usually what you do is you kind of roll it one direction, then you kind of flip it around and roll it the other direction. Then what you do is make sure you have a nice clean surface to work on. If you're working at the studio, you'll see something like this, either canvas or a HardieBacker board. This right here is called HardieBacker. It's a tile working material, so it's porous. You don't want to roll on anything that's like really smooth and shiny, like a polyurethane board or a really smooth table or something like that. You want to have some porosity in the surface that you're working on. So what you want to do is when you're rolling the coils, the main thing that happens to people when they first try this is they just go back and forth in one motion like this, and you end up with a really kind of oblong, a coil that is sort of an oval. So since we're going to make walls that are even thickness, we want to have the coils be as even thickness as possible. And so what you want to do is you want to keep changing your hand positioning on this. So you can see that sometimes I let it roll a few revolutions, and then anytime you see anything like an oval area developing, just roll it up on the edge there and kind of just pat it down. And and then you can kind of see what I'm doing here is I change the, I don't just go back and forth like this. If I just go like that, it'll make it oval. So I keep changing things. I'm not pushing super hard here, kind of just trying to make the pressure pretty even. And what I'm trying to do is just make a really nice kind of smooth round coil. Now, this is going to be a really small object, so what I'm going to do is I don't need a coil this long, especially because I'm going to thin it out even more. So I'm just going to tear this. I'm going to set it to the side. It's a good idea to have some plastic sitting here so that you can set these on a piece of plastic. So out of the camera view, I have a piece of plastic that has several coils that I've already rolled out. Because since this is porous, this is going to absorb moisture, which is good so it doesn't stick, but it also can make some little cracking there, but we can fix that later. So we're gonna roll these out like this. Okay, I'm gonna split that again. And one of the things I always kind of mention is that coil building is scalable. And what I mean by that is that the larger the object, or the thicker the walls, the larger the coils can be. So there isn't one size, it's not one size fits all, for coils. So, really, really large pots, like pots that are, 5, 6 feet, 7 feet tall, people might be working with a coil that big, we're gonna be working with a coil that is much smaller. Like, for example, if you're going to do some carving, like if you wanted to do some sgraffito carving, or you just wanted to be able to cut into the clay and have a little bit more to work with. You know, you might roll out a thicker coil just because you want the walls to be thicker, you know, so that's okay. This is kind of a medium thickness for this particular object. For a larger object, like if you had an object that was, say, you know, 12 inches or 10 inches high, this would be really small. Like well, I would recommend you working with a coil that was maybe 3 times that size, you know, for a larger object. So, okay, so now that we have some coils, now, you know, they're not perfect, but they're you know, sufficiently round, and you know, there's not a lot of divots and things like that. The more, you know, uniform this is, the easier it is going to be when you go to actually put the coils together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring out my thing that I've already cut. So I pounded this slab out. I used a rolling pin. The other tools, actually, to step kind of backward just a little bit, the other tools that you might have handy that I've already used the rolling pin. Okay. What I would also do is have some, you know, a container of water handy. I would have your flexible metal rib ready, a fettling knife. I might not use the fettling knife much anymore, but I used it when I rolled the slab out, and then I just used, it wasn't this piece of plastic, but I just found something round that I used as a template, and I held it over there, and then I used the fettling knife to cut around it. The other things that you might have handy are a small sponge. This is a nice tool. This comes in the toolkit that you purchased from Kentucky Mud Works. And this can be a good tool for reaching inside, especially if you have a small object, you can't get your hands down to the bottom of it. You can reach down in there with this and work on, you know, smoothing coils at the base here. So this is always a good tool to have out. You may need your needle tool, so you might as well have that out too. Sometimes you use the needle tool to cut a flat edge across the top. And sometimes for texturing and things like that, you might have a serrated rib too. Now well, and one more thing, we have also our chamois, which we may use at the very end to smooth the rim of the piece off. The other thing to note here is that this clay is wet, and you know, is wet out of the bag, basically as wet as it would be in a mixer. And we're going to put coils that are also wet on top of wet clay. Anytime we have coils that are wet on wet, we do not need to score those. A lot of people in the beginning, they start putting lots of water on it or slip. You don't need to do that as long as you have sufficiently wet clay on both sides. So in order for clay to stick together, it needs water and pressure. So the pressure is going to come from our fingers or a tool like this, and the moisture is already in the clay. Now, if either one of these is not as wet, like it's a leather hard or almost leather hard, then you need to score and slip it. And I'm gonna just do a scoring and slipping demonstration on another video. But since these are wet, you know, we can just set these right on here, and I will show you how to connect them. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna roll this like that, and I'm gonna break this off a little bit too far. So I don't wanna just butt these up like this, okay? Because right here, when I go to connect that, I have a little less clay than I have here. So I want to have a little bit too much because then I can just cut it off. So what I do is I just overlap that a little bit, just like that. Okay, it's a seam. I'm gonna fix it later, but it's gonna be much easier to fix if I have a little bit too much clay than not enough. The other thing that's very important with this is always lay the coil on the inside edge of the slab. Okay, so the reason for that is that I'm gonna connect the coil to the slab here on the inside, and I'm gonna do the same on the outside. If I put the coil on the outside edge, I can connect it here, but it's gonna be harder for me to connect the bottom. And a lot of times I see people build a whole coil vessel, they don't connect this bottom part here, and then a crack develops. Okay, so we don't want that. So we're gonna put this on the inside edge, okay, And so you also want to factor that into your sizing. So when you're thinking about the size of your object, remember that whatever this is, if it's a square or if it's peanut shaped or round like this is your outside dimension. Okay, and it's the outside dimension at the base, so it doesn't have to, these don't have to be straight up. You could come out like that, or you could come in, you know, but just remember that this is the outside dimension. Okay, so I'm going to set this on there, and just kind of make sure that it's centered all the way around like that. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to brace it on the outside here, and I'm going to push down with my finger into the bottom. And so basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to merge the clay from this coil into the slab. Okay. Okay. When I get to this edge here, what I'm going to do, or this seam rather, I'm going to actually take some of this clay and smush it this way, and smush some of this clay this way. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to basically smush the, you know, one piece of clay into the other. Okay. So, you know, the main thing is always supporting the outside. Okay. So then what I do is I go around and I kind of clean up the inside, trying to smush a little bit of the clay from the base back into the coil. Okay. We're going to add a little bit of clay just down there. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. But so now we have the seam on the outside. Now, if you want to have your coils exposed on the outside, meaning that you can still see all the lines, that's okay if you want to do that for this project. But if you do that, you have to really make sure that the inside is smoothed really well. Okay. On this, see, the advantage of smoothing the other side too is that I can make sure that this clay sticks to this clay. Anytime I have a seam like that, it's an area of weakness. So I can get away with it if I really do the inside really well, or just to be safe, I'm gonna smooth that out too. So since this is so small, I can just hold it in my hands and do this, you know. If you know, if this was a larger piece or something that was a little bit more fragile, I would have to do this, you know, on the board. But okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm just kind of making sure that it's not getting too wide. The one thing that happens very, very often with beginning people is that these get really, really wide. Okay, so since we're going to make a functional cup, you know, I don't want this to be like a bowl. Like, I want it to be more upright. So I'm going to, after every coil, I'm going to come back around, and I'm just going to pinch this and just make sure that this is coming up, you know, in the direction that I want. Okay. Now, I'm not going to worry too much with how the clay is looking on the outside, because I'm going to, after a few more coils, I'm going to come back and I'm going to smooth it. So I'm going to take another coil. Now I'm going to try to remember where that seam was. So that seam was right here. Okay. So it's like on a brick wall. You don't want to line, you don't see bricks all lined up where the seam is on the same spot. So I'm going to pick a different spot. Okay. And what I'm going to do here is, the important thing is that I'm putting the coil on the inside edge of the thing. So you can see it's slightly on the inside. If you wanted to go outward like this, you would then set it slightly on the outside edge, or even kind of right on the top here. But I want this to go more vertical, so it's generally a good practice to keep this on the slight inside edge of this. It's much easier to open this out and go vertical than it is to, you know, if it's too wide for this to come back. If it's too wide, you're not going to be able to compress the rim of it, so you're going to have to actually cut sections of it out, and it's a lot of work, and generally at that point it's better just to start over. Okay, so again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to squish that past there so I have a little extra clay to work with. Okay, and now I'm going to, what I'm doing here is my thumb is kind of coming down. I'm using this part of my hand here to brace the outside, and I'm kind of kneading that clay down into you know, into the other coil. Okay. I'm working also on a banding wheel, although this is so small, I'm just mostly turning it like this. We have several of these in the studio. We don't have enough for people to take these home, but if you are, for this it's not a big deal because you can just move it like this, but these are really easy to make. You can buy these, there's just a Lazy Susan metal thing in there, and they're really cheap to make. Okay, so I'm smushing this clay in there. Okay, I'm gonna come around and, you know, clean that up, make sure you don't want to see any seams. Okay, so you will have a good connection if you don't see any of the seams there. You really want to squish it together and make sure that you don't see any of that. Okay. Now I said earlier that I was going to put a little extra clay down there. Looking at this now, I don't really need to, but if you see that this is really thin, like if you have a thin spot right here, which is actually pretty common, what you do is you just roll a really, really thin coil, like it's almost as thin as you can roll it, like this big. And you just lay a little coil in there and you smear it around. This can also often be a moment where the clay is kind of weak because it's going, as the clay dries, it shrinks. And so you can imagine that if this is coming up here, the top edge is going to dry much more quickly than the bottom, because the bottom is underneath the, you know, either on canvas or on some sort of board. And so there's what happens is there's kind of a tension that builds up. And so when things crack, they very often can crack here around the edge. So we just want to make sure that that is really, you know, stout. So the other thing that you might be noticing is you see these small little cracks here, okay? This is just because the clay is a little bit on the dry side. And so, you know, the process of rolling it out on the board dried it out a little bit. My hands are absorbing some of the water from the clay. So I'm gonna take the water that I have here and I'm gonna just put a little bit of water. You don't need much at all. You just need a tiny bit, you know, and I'm just gonna, you know, kind of press the water in there. And then I'm gonna use my fingers and kind of just burnish the clay, kind of smooth it out. It's a good idea to do this, you know, as soon as you see it kind of developing. You don't want to get big rifts in the side of the object because it's going to be harder to fix if the cracks are kind of big. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm just kind of going around and I'm sort of pinching here. And what I'm doing is kind of there's several sort of things that I'm looking for. And this is where your hands are really sort of communicating to the rest of your body or your mind what's happening. So I can't, with my eye, I can't see if there's a thin spot. Okay, so there's a little tiny bit of a thin spot there. I would never know that unless I pinched it like that. So I'm going around kind of looking for areas that are too thick or too thin. You know, it's mostly pretty good. The other thing that I'm doing was when I'm pinching it, it's getting a tiny bit taller. So it might be a little hard to see in the video, but when I pinch this, it comes up just a tiny bit. So you see that? You know, and so that's good because just because I'm using a coil that thick doesn't mean that the wall thickness has to be that thick. So you'll notice that, you know, on your larger objects, you might have a coil that is that big around, but then the wall thickness might be half of that. And that's because you go around and you pinch this, you know, after each coil. Okay, so now these coils that I had laying out on the HardieBack are already getting a little dry. So I'm gonna get these coils that I have laying out on some plastic. Okay, so what I did is I rolled some out on plastic and kind of let them hang out there for a minute. Okay, so now again, I'm gonna use another coil. I'm gonna pick a different spot to line the seam up here. And again, I'm gonna set this on the inside edge like this, okay? When I first go and push it on there, all I'm doing is I'm just gently pushing so it sticks. You know, I just don't want the coil falling in there. You know, so Remember, a little extra clay there, okay? Then I'm gonna try to hold this a little closer to the camera so you can see. So you can kind of see what I'm doing here. This hand is bracing. My thumb is moving some of this clay up and kind of smushing it. Okay, smushing it together. Now when I get here, I'm gonna just smooth this out, kind of join that section together. Okay. Now, again, I'm not too concerned with what this is looking like. I'm mostly just concerned with getting the coils together. I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna smooth that out later. You know, so it's kind of like a two-phase thing. Like I mainly just want the coils to stick together right now and to make sure that it's going in the right, you know, direction. Like I don't want it to get, you know, going in the wrong shape. But in terms of this ugliness here, I'm gonna smooth that out later as I go. So, okay, so now that I have the coil joined in there, I'm gonna then come around and I'm gonna make sure that I have good thickness and also that it's not getting too wide, okay? So you see what I'm doing is I kind of push it in like that. So if it's getting too wide, you kind of like go, like kind of collar it, and you're compressing that rim, okay? I'm gonna put one more coil on and then I'll show you how to use the metal rib. And the metal rib will be nice to be able to start to fine tune the shape. And okay. So again, you don't need water at this stage because the clay is wet, okay? People that do use water here will make their pieces so wet that they often fall over or they're just so hard to work with, they're so floppy. Okay, you don't need it, and it can be actually, you know, it could make it harder to work with. Okay. So I'm smoothing out both sides. If this were a larger piece, I would be using two hands. Like this is so small, it's almost like small enough where it's hard to work with. That's why I'm often doing this thing where I'm like pushing down and using one-handed. So one hand does both things. One hand is smearing the clay, so my thumb is smearing it, and the other hand is bracing the outside. If it were a larger piece, I might be doing that with two hands. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of collar this in a little bit. It's getting a little wide. Okay, but I am going to show you how to start to clean this edge up, or this side here. So I'm going to take this metal rib here, and this has a flex to it. This is one of the most used tools in ceramics, but it is also oddly one of the most dangerous tools because this edge, or this edge if you're using this side, gets really sharp. So when I'm scraping on this, right, okay, clay, some clay bodies have actual sand in them, but clay has sort of a sandy-like texture sometimes. Like there's a material called grog in there, and so what it's doing is it's sharpening the edge here. So you got to be really careful when you're scraping here. You want to get in the habit of taking the clay off in this direction, okay, not this direction. Like you don't want to get a bunch of clay in there and go, you know, because that's the way that you can cut yourself, okay? So what I'm doing here is you can see the area that I haven't done this and then the area that I have done this, okay? So you can see the difference. It's much smoother and straight up. You can also see that it's getting a little taller on this side because I'm literally like lifting the clay up a little bit. So the trick is with this is I like to kind of come at a slight angle like this, okay? The trick is to always support it on the inside, okay? You never want to just be going like this because then you're gonna squish this thing in too much. So this is the more perpendicular you keep this when you scrape it, the more it'll cut off. And when you do find a low point, you can actually lay this over and then start to smooth the clay over. So if you have some clay that's kind of built up on there like that, okay, then right there you see it's like a little divot. I can lay this over and then smooth that out like that and get rid of that divot. Okay. So now I'm just going to keep going all around. I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit so that this video isn't too long. Okay, it's always a challenging thing to do these demos without them getting too long, but okay. So you can kind of see what we have already started, you know. This is one of those things where I would want to come back at several points during the drying stages and you know, come back and work on that texture or the surface. I might even add some texture. Okay, let me add a couple more coils here real quick. Okay. Okay, I'm going to show you how to cut this rim off here in just a minute, but let me get this a little bit taller. You know, on these small objects, you can pick them up like that and, you know, and kind of get a sense for where, you know, what direction they're going. On a large object, obviously you can't do that, so you'd want to, you know, step back from the object and take a look. Plus, the other thing is that this is getting a little bit, you know, you can see it's getting a little floppy here. You know, if I weren't doing a demonstration with this, I might let this sit for just a minute. And, you know, I might, you know, 20 minutes, something like that, and just stiffen up just a little bit. Not so much that the clay is, like, hard to attach anymore, but just enough to kind of stiffen it up, you know. So, let me get one more coil on there. Let's see, I'm trying to find a good size coil here. I got lots of options. This piece is so small it doesn't really have the weight to push this banding wheel around, so. Okay. Now I'm gonna just quickly kind of work on the inside. Again, this is something that you would want to spend a little bit more time on. I'm just trying to kind of rush through this to sort of show you a few more techniques, but you know, you'd want to, you know, use your fingers and kind of like smooth that out a little bit better. The other thing is that if you see something that you can't reach, like if you wanted to smooth out something down there, this is a great tool to do that with. Okay, so okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to cut this rim off. I'm going to just make a line. I'm going to set this kind of in the middle of this banding wheel, and I'm going to hold my needle tool here. And the other thing, if you have something handy, you can also prop, I don't know if you can see that, you can prop something up here and you know, basically spin this and trace that line. You know, for this is a small, you know, functional object, I'm just going to use my hand here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trace a line I'm not cutting through it all in one spot here. I'm just making an even line there. And then I'm gonna start cutting through this. And this is just gonna take off that sort of, that rough kind of top, you know, the uneven top edge of this. And I'm gonna clean this up too. Okay, so now I'm gonna put a little bit of water on my fingers, and I'm gonna just start to work on that edge a little bit. Okay, so you can kind of see what I'm doing is I'm kind of thinning this out and I'm smoothing it. Okay, you can also use your chamois. So the way that these work is that you want to soak this in water, you know, for a few minutes, and this gets really soft and pliable. This is really more of a throwing tool. You use it when you're throwing to work on the rims, but you can also use it here too. So you can kind of see what I'm doing. I kind of hold it with a couple fingers here and let that chamois wrap around, I don't know if you can see that, wrap around the rim. And you know, but this is a nice tool for cleaning up the edge. And you know, if you're gonna drink out of this, you gotta keep in mind that your lips are gonna touch that. So you don't want something rough like that, you know? So you wanna have it be, you know, a little on the thin side too. The top edge here is often thinner than the rest of the object. Okay, so what that'll do is it'll give it the illusion that the whole object is thinner. And it's generally more comfortable to drink out of, you know, unless it's a diner mug. Diner mugs have a real thick rim, but they can get away with it because they're a diner mug. But we are going to make this a little bit thinner and kind of clean this edge up. And oh. Okay, so this, I don't want to make this video too long, so I think this is going to be getting close to a place to stop here. And so what I would do is I would let this set up a little bit more. I'd get that rim a little bit more how I want it, a little bit smoother, you know, come around with my fingers and everything. And I would let that set up, and then I would come back and I would do some more smoothing here. You know, so I can, because right now, the pressure I would need to do to push, you know, and to scrape that off is going to deform the cup. So, you know, I would probably also come back and I might do a slight little bevel on this bottom edge here and kind of start to make that a little bit more presentable and rounded. Okay, sharp edge like that. This is going to be a functional object. It's going to be in the dishwasher or getting knocked around in the sink when you're washing it. You know, you don't want to have any sharp edges that could chip off. So I'd round that edge off a little bit. But you know, I could also come back and I could maybe, you know, work on the texture. So I could maybe come back and do some lines in there, or do something that would you know, create a different you know, a different surface. You know, if I kind of pat that down a little bit, take all the sharp edges off, you know, that would be a nice surface to, say, stain or something like that. So let it set up a little bit so you can hold on to it without it deforming too much, and then just come back and experiment with it and make a small little cup. You know, clean it up better than this one because it's just a demo. But anyway, I think that's it. So just have fun with it. You know, these are warm-up vessels, so I just want you to experiment and get some more experience, and you know, just have a good time with it.